Welcome to Healthy Living. I'm Lori Johnson. Thanks for joining us today. Our topic is achieving and maintaining a healthy weight. My guest is Dr. William Davis, author of the new book, Super Body, a 3-week program to harness the new science of body composition and restore your youthful contours. And many of you recognize Dr. Davis. He's the best-selling author of Wheat Belly and Super Gut. Dr. Davis, it's wonderful to see you again. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks, Lori. Thanks for having me back.
So this book, not only is it about losing weight and maintaining a healthy weight, but it's also about sculpting the body. In other words, not just hitting that number, that magic number, but having the shape you want, right?
Right, Lori. So it's no surprise to you or your listeners that conventional thinking in healthcare, but specifically weight loss, there are many problems, right? Think about how many years women were prescribed, for instance, Premarin, horse-derived estrogens, and human women were told that if you take this drug, you'll have less endometrial cancer, heart disease, dementia, etc. Of course, we now know the opposite was true. The drug actually caused or increased the risk of all those diseases. In other words, healthcare can get it wrong in a terrible way for many years before the science clarifies. The same principle applies here to weight loss. We now know, not my speculation, Lori, good science over the last few years, that if you lose weight by reducing calories, we could call it move more, eat less. We could call it smaller portion sizes. We could call it a bariatric procedure, like lap band or gastric bypass. We could call it a pharmaceutical agent, like a GLP-1 agonist. But they're all variations in the same theme, reducing calorie intake, and the science is clear. Yes, they work in the near term, but you set landmines for yourself over the long term. Not just regain of weight, but also accelerated disability, falls, fractures, frailty, loss of independence, using a walker or scooter, motorized scooter, dementia, and even, shockingly, earlier death.
So, Dr. Davis, you talk a lot about, in this book, about making sure to achieve and maintain muscle mass. How important is it to do that? And in doing that, do we need to hit the gym all the time?
You know, lots of women are scared of this conversation because they think I'm going to say, go to the gym 2 hours a day, 5. No. We're going to address factors that accelerate muscle loss. We have to accept, Lori, just by aging, doing nothing else but aging, which we all do, of course, we lose about 30% of our youthful muscle. So by age 70, you have many, many pounds less muscle than you had. And that's a critical thing because that accelerates all kinds of phenomena. Your exposure, for instance, to diseases, frailty, loss of independence, dementia, all those things we all dread. Now, we accelerate that process when we lose weight because all those methods I mentioned, diets, bariatric procedures, pharmaceuticals. Let's say you spent $12,000 for a GLP-1 agonist drug. That's what it costs for about a year, let's say.
For common folks, GLP agonists are Ozempic, Wegovy, Zepbound, those other ones with the shots.
Exactly. And you know what, Lori? They work. You do lose. Let's say you paid $12,000 to lose 40 pounds. You think things are great, right? You fit into your size 8 dress now instead of a size 36 or whatever. But of the 40 pounds you lost, 10 pounds was muscle. You stopped the drug. Most people can't afford that forever, especially now with the way the economy is. You regain all the fat and more. You don't regain muscle, maybe a little bit, but that's it. You're now much more muscle depleted than you were. And your exposure to conditions like dementia, heart disease, coronary disease, disability is now worse than it was before. There have been many studies in which people who've lost a lot of weight were tracked over 10 years, 20 years. So in aggregate, we're talking about over 60,000 people. These are large databases like NHANES, the NIH's database, or EPIC Norfolk, Western European, or the ASPRI. 60,000 people tracked over many years, and it's become clear people who've lost 10% or more of their weight by reducing calories. Think about that. A 180-pound woman losing 18 pounds, not uncommon. A 240-pound guy losing 24 pounds, very common. You've shaved several years off your life. In fact, the mortality rate about over 8 to 10 years is about 50%. So old thinking is fatal thinking. It sets you up for accelerated disability and even death. And so what I'm trying to do, Lori, is educate people. There are things you can do that have nothing to do with going to the gym. You could do that. That's great, go to the gym. But there are things you can do to set right the situation in the first place that prevents the loss of and dysfunction of muscle.
It's so important to hold on to your muscle. We know that if you have muscle, you're less likely to break something as you get older. And we know that falls and broken bones are one of the leading causes of death for some of our senior citizens. And as you point out in your book, muscle is actually improves your metabolism better than fat, right?
Absolutely. And you can often think about muscle as antagonizing fat. That is fat, but fat specifically, Lori, in the abdomen. The fat in your buttocks and your neck or chest, so-called subcutaneous fat. It may be an aesthetic issue, but it's really not a danger to you beyond just added weight on your weight-bearing joints. It's the fat in your abdomen. It's the fat that encircles your intestines and liver and pancreas. That's a very problematic form of fat. And even worse, the more abdominal fat you have, the more you have what's called myosteatosis, infiltration of muscle with fat. Once that starts, which is a very common accompaniment to abdominal fat, so you have a protuberant tummy from abdominal fat, you likely have fat around your heart, accelerating heart disease, in your pancreas, accelerating diabetes, in your kidneys, damaging your kidneys, and in your muscle, eroding strength and impairing muscle mass. And so, in other words, if all you do is lose weight, all those methods, by the way, Lori, don't specifically target loss of abdominal fat. They specifically or preferentially target loss of subcutaneous fat, the less problematic form of fat. So what I'm advocating is a smarter way. Let's specifically target abdominal fat. Let's get rid of myosteatosis. Let's not just preserve muscle, but even try to restore youthful muscle and thereby avoid all those horrible things you mentioned: fractures, falls, frailty, loss of independence, dementia, and earlier death.
So the 3-week program is sort of divided up into 3 separate parts. And the first part really focuses on what to eat. And this is a way to lose weight without losing muscle. And the first thing you talk about is eating whole foods. Can you talk about what whole foods are? We know there's a grocery store called Whole Foods, but so a lot of people are like, what is a whole food exactly?
So let's put aside that there's a company or store called Whole Foods.
So does that mean we have to shop at Whole Foods? No.
No.
Okay.
No, it means food as close as possible to its real form. It could be the green peppers and lettuce you grew in your backyard garden. It could be foods that look like they're supposed to look, like an avocado, or meats or fish, but not something that's been highly processed, pulverized, dried, desiccated, all the things we're familiar with that comprise the majority of foods in most supermarkets. So we're going to eat more like our great-grandmothers did. We eat real whole foods. That alone is a big step. Now, what we don't do is cut calories, but we do reduce or eliminate processed garbage foods. And you recognize these. These are chips and cookies and soft drinks and juices, all the stuff that now dominates, sadly, the diets of most Americans, most especially children and adolescents. I fear for the future of these generations because they've been inundated with marketing and an ignorant and misguided dietary guidelines that tell people to do things like cut their fat. So you know what? The last century has shown us how not to eat. In some ways, it made us smarter by making blunder after blunder in diet. It showed us how not to eat. But ironically, it's going back to the ways of our great grandmothers. Back then, if you went to the beach in 1940, 1950, you'd see a bunch of skinny people that we would say are abnormally skinny, but that's normal. And so that's what we're trying to do. Now, we're not going to cut calories. We're not going to cut fat. We don't reduce saturated fat. We don't push the plate away. We don't use smaller portion size. You eat like you want to. But the thing is, when you start to revert back to whole foods, a lot of abnormal appetite stimulating ingredients in modern food are eliminated. And you're going to find that appetite is different. You're no longer anywhere near as hungry as you used to be. And so, yeah, your intake of food will be reduced, but you're not doing it on purpose. And we're not going to be ingesting the foods that distort insulin responses. We're going to try to normalize insulin responses because that's a critical feature in trying to maintain muscle and lose abdominal fat.
That definitely makes a lot of sense. All right, we're going to take a break and be right back with Dr. William Davis. The book is called Super Body. Stay with us. Welcome back to Healthy Living. We're continuing our discussion with Dr. William Davis, author of the book Super Body. Love the title, a 3-week program to harness the new science of body composition and restore your youthful contours. Who doesn't want to do that? So we were talking about the foods that you recommend, and you talked about whole foods. We've got that. And also, you really would like people to go organic. This is a kind of controversial thing because organic does tend to be more expensive, but you really believe that it's worth the price.
Absolutely. And this caused us to think about the status of our gastrointestinal microbiome. That is the trillions of microbes that live in our gastrointestinal tracts. So in a normal situation, let's say our great grandmothers, there was trillions of microbes living in the colon. That is way, way down where stool is held before you evacuate it into the toilet. In modern people, something very terrible has happened, and that is our wild overexposure, for instance, to antibiotics. Most people by age 40, Lori, have gotten 30 courses of antibiotics. Most children, for every 1,000 children, 1,300 prescriptions for antibiotics are written every year. Every day, 650,000 prescriptions are written for antibiotics. That one course, that single course of, let's say, azithromycin or whatever, wipes out hundreds of species in your gastrointestinal tract. Those species, many of which were essential and important. And one of the things they did was suppress the excessive proliferation of fecal stool microbes. These are species like E. coli, Salmonella, Campylobacter that your listeners may recognize because they're also the cause of food poisoning. We're not very good at tolerating those stool organisms when they migrate out of the colon. So when you lose those protective species, stool microbes ascend into the 24 feet of small intestine. There's this very common situation called small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. We call it SIBO, S-I-B-O. Now, the small intestine is very permeable. And when you have trillions of fecal microbes that have invaded the small intestine, they live and die very rapidly. They live for hours. They shed their toxic compounds, such as endotoxin that enters the bloodstream. That's now called endotoxemia, a major driver of muscle loss, muscle function impairment, loss of strength, expansion of abdominal fat, as well as either the initiator or a worsening factor in weight gain, type 2 diabetes, autoimmune diseases, coronary disease, atrial fibrillation, dementia, cognitive impairment, Parkinson's disease, Lou Gehrig's disease, fibromyalgia, rheumatoid arthritis. In other words, we've got to reconsider all that we thought we knew, including in how we managed to lose weight. We need to factor in the participation of the gastrointestinal microbiome.
Well, I'm going to ask you a question I'm sure you get all the time. What if your doctor says you really need this antibiotic and you take a course of antibiotics? Is your gut microbiome wrecked? How do you fix it?
So, Lori, what I'm not saying is abolish all antibiotics. Of course not. Even the CDC concedes that the majority of antibiotics, or at least a large portion of the antibiotic prescriptions written, are unnecessary. There seems to be this impulse to do something. And it's not uncommon, actually, for patients or consumers to say, hey, I need an antibiotic prescription for my son because he's got a cough or something like that. So the wild overprescription of antibiotics that has become a phenomenon since 1928, when penicillin was discovered, and it's exploded now. And of course, this is even worsened by such things as glyphosate residues in food, the herbicide, which is also a very potent antibiotic, preservatives in processed foods. These are compounds like potassium sorbate or sodium benzoate that are antimicrobial in food, like it's supposed to be, but also in you when you eat that processed food. So if all you do is take a drug or have a bariatric procedure, it didn't address the original cause.
Absolutely. All right, we're going to take another break and be right back with Dr. William Davis. The book is called Super Body. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Healthy Living. We're talking about how to have a super body inside and out with Dr. William Davis, author of the book Super Body. You were talking before about eating whole foods, organic, and here is probably the most controversial thing that you've ever done is you also advocate people staying away from grains, no grains, and then also no gluten-free processed foods.
Yeah, we need several hours to cover all that. But
Yes.
in a nutshell, so when you eliminate modern wheat, I point that out because modern wheat is not the same as the wheat of 1960 or even the wheat of, just a few decades ago. So we're dealing with something that was created in a laboratory. And one of the effects is there's a protein. People say gluten, but it's actually the gliadin protein of wheat that we don't have the digestive enzymes to break down. So it's broken down partially to 4 or 5 amino acid long peptides. And these peptides are very odd because they cross into the brain, bind to the opioid receptors, but they don't make you high. They bind to other opioid receptors that say fentanyl doesn't bind to. Instead, they increase appetite. They're potent appetite stimulants, specifically for processed and ultra-processed junk foods. So we have a public being sold and marketed these foods that are very powerful appetite stimulants. When you get rid of wheat and grains, thereby the gliadin-derived opioid peptide appetite stimulants, you find yourself oddly freed. You say, you know what? I'm not hungry. I had a couple of eggs with some sausage for breakfast at 7 a.m. It's 3 p.m. I forgot to eat lunch. I'm getting a little bit hungry. I might have something for dinner. Now, there's the whole eating behavior, your whole style of eating, and the feeling of hunger is something very different. The great thing about that is it puts you in control of food choice and appetite, and you're no longer victimized by the impulsive eating of big food and processed foods.
And it's really fascinating because you say go ahead and try to limit your sugar, but go ahead and have fruits, for example, that are very sweet too. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, fruit is a little bit of a problem only because the fruit of decades past is different than modern fruit. Modern fruit has been hybridized and bred for a low fiber, high sugar content. So we tend to preferentially choose berries, for instance, like blueberries, raspberries, strawberries, that are limited in sugar content you can get away with. Unfortunately, most other fruit has been bred for high sugar content, and sadly, it's an issue. So we have to limit portion size. Now, as you rebuild a broken microbiome, which, by the way, Lori, is not that difficult. The conventional answer, if your doctor even knows what SIBO or disruptive microbiome even means, he'll say something like, well, here's a prescription for Xifaxan, an antibiotic. Now, wait a minute here. Antibiotics are a big part of the reason we got to this mess. Do you think an antibiotic is part of the solution? So one of the things I've developed is a microbial solution. You can take a commercial probiotic. It won't work, Laurie. It will not work because they're nothing more than haphazard collections of microbes. But there are intelligent, smarter ways to use, to put the gastrointestinal microbiome to work to reverse that situation.
All right, we're going to take one final break and be right back with Dr. William Davis. The book is called Super Body. Stay tuned. Welcome back. We're talking with Dr. William Davis, author of the book Super Body. And before the break, we were talking about the loss of these microbes that are so important. Can you elaborate on that?
Sure, Lori. So, among the hundreds of species we lose with even one course of antibiotics, those microbes had roles. They played a part in your health, in multiple aspects of health: emotional health, physiological health, how much fat you had, where it's deposited, how much muscle you have, your hormonal status. And so we work to restore lost microbes. My favorite microbes to restore: Lactobacillus reuteri, Lactobacillus gasseri, and a Bacillus subtilis. There are many others, of course, but those are three what we call keystone species. Restore those microbes lost, they help rebuild the rest. No one can take thousands or hundreds or thousands of microbes to restore, but you can plant the seeds of important microbes that do the job for you. And that's what we do. We cultivate those microbes. We actually do it as something that looks and smells like yogurt. It's not yogurt. You can't buy it in the store, but it looks and smells like yogurt. But making this fermented product that we label yogurt is a way to increase bacterial counts thousands of times. In other words, if you go to battle, you want to go with a big army. You don't want to go with 1,000 soldiers up against 100,000 soldiers, right? You want to go to battle with lots and lots of soldiers. In this case, you want billions, hundreds of billions of microbes. And we do that by this process of fermenting these microbes using some very specific methods, but very easy. You do this in the comfort of your kitchen. There's no doctor involved. There's no antibiotics involved. It's just restoring microbes that you're going to cultivate in something that looks and smells like yogurt. And that's a big first step to reclaiming control of your gastrointestinal microbiome and thereby shape and body composition.
Well, this is fantastic information, Dr. Davis. Thank you so much for being with us today and for your amazing work. Once again, the book is called Super Body, a 3-week program to harness the new science of body composition and restore your youthful contours. It was wonderful to see you, sir. Thanks again.
Thank you, Lori. Same here.
And thanks to you viewers for tuning into this edition of Healthy Living. I'm Lori Johnson, and we'll see you again next week.